everybody. I'm Lori. Well, thank you for coming to the first table talk of the season. On the back counter, we have a schedule for all the upcoming table talks. This season is going to run through June of next year instead of May. We will be skipping December. It'll be the third Wednesday of every month, just like today. So I hope you can all come to the upcoming table talks as well. Today I'm pleased to welcome our education and interpretation supervisor, Phillip Mayhair, who's going to speak to us today on the War of 1812 and show us some wonderful items that the village uses and things that they would have used then. So thank you, and hopefully welcome Phillip.
All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out today. So we've got a presentation focusing on the War of 1812 on the Gulf Coast, what was going on here during that time. We'll get into some background information to kind of set up the campaign here on the Gulf Coast. After the presentation, I've got all sorts of stuff up here. Feel free to come check it out. I can talk to you in more detail about the clothing, the weapons, the food the soldiers were eating. I've got some maps of the region as well as Pensacola from that time period, and then some portraits of some of the people that we'll be talking about as well. So definitely stick around after the presentation and come check everything out. So to get started, we'll start with a really awesome picture of a flintlock musket being fired. But we'll get into a little bit of background about the War of 1812 in general. It's one of those time periods that really gets overlooked in American history. It's kind of overshadowed, it's sandwiched right between the American Revolution and the American Civil War. But there was a lot of stuff going on in that early Republican period when the United States was growing and expanding. First, to get into a little bit about the causes of how the war came to be, there was a group in Congress that were known as the War Hawks because they were pushing for the United States to get into a war with Great Britain. The reasons that they were giving for why we should go to war was, one, American sailors were being impressed and put into service in the British Navy. That was going on. They weren't happy about that. There had been some forts out west that were supposed to be turned over by the British at the end of the American Revolution, and that didn't happen. These guys claimed that the British were inciting American Indians out on the frontier to attack American settlers. And so they had their list of grievances, and the British were very much occupied. They were not ready to go to war with the United States. There was a guy named Napoleon over in Europe who had conquered most of Europe and was at war with the British, so they were a little bit preoccupied. And the British were making concessions, trying to do everything that they could not to go to war with the United States. But it didn't work out. Congress did pass a resolution to go to war. President James Madison signed that declaration, and the war started in 1812. How convenient. A lot of historians today kind of look at it and think that a lot of these people just really kind of wanted America to be able to prove itself on the world stage, prove that we were able to go toe-to-toe with the Europeans. But the country was very much split on support of the war. The southern and western states like Georgia and Tennessee, they were all for it. They were ready to go. Let's go invade Canada. Let's go take over the American Southeast. We're going to get all this territory. But up north in New England, the northern states were very much not in support of the war. They were very much against it. Their biggest trading partner was Great Britain, so they knew that that was going to be very disruptive for them. And in fact, some of the northern states were even talking about secession as early as 1812. So the country was very much split on support. Now, once we get this war going, this is what the United States is looking like at the time period. We had fairly recently gotten the Louisiana Purchase, so that is part of the United States now. All of Florida, all the Gulf Coast, still Spanish territory. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. But when the war starts, there's a lot of battles going on up north with the Canadian border. Canada is still part of the British Empire at this time period. The Americans would make some advances into Canada and get pushed back. The British would make some advances down into the United States and get pushed back. It was pretty much a deadlock there on the northern border. Then the British decided to go in on the East Coast, Chesapeake Bay area, march right on into Washington, set everything on fire. They did burn the White House and the Capitol and some buildings there, but they were repulsed from their major invasion at a fort called Fort McHenry. And that is, of course, where the Star-Spangled Banner gets written, and that will eventually become our national anthem. But they didn't have a whole lot of success on the East Coast, so by 1814, the British are starting to look at the Gulf Coast as a place to launch a campaign. And their target is the port city of New Orleans. They knew there was a lot of goods sitting at the port that they could capture, and they also wanted control of the Mississippi River. If they could get control of the Mississippi River, look where they could go, anywhere they wanted to, pretty much in North America. So this was a very, very important target for the British. Now, Spanish West Florida at the start of the early 19th century, much larger than it is today. West Florida actually extended all the way to the Mississippi River. In 1803, we had the Louisiana Purchase. Louisiana Territory had belonged to Spain for the past 40 or so years. They had secretly given it back to France, and then France turned around and sold it to the United States. So it was a very quick transfer there. The Americans said, hey, the Louisiana Purchase included everything up to the Perdido River, and we should just go ahead and make that American territory. Spain said, no, that's not correct. It ends at the Mississippi River. So there was some debate over that territory, but West Florida included everything going that way. That was all Spanish territory for a number of years. 1803, Louisiana, everything west of the Mississippi, including New Orleans, becomes American territory. Baton Rouge, just a little bit to the north, was a Spanish colony. There was a Spanish fort located there. But after the Louisiana Purchase, more and more Americans started creeping into that territory, and they decided they were just going to overthrow the Spanish and declared themselves to be the independent Republic of West Florida. That lasted for about 3 months before they requested that the United States come on in and annex that territory, which they did so in late 1810. So that is Baton Rouge, that little area is now American territory. And then after the War of 1812 gets going in 1813, the Americans decide, let's go ahead and just take Mobile while we're at it. So in April of 1813, the U.S. Army marches into Mobile, takes control of that fort. The Spanish aren't really able to stop them. So by 1813, the United States has now taken everything up to the Perdido River, giving Florida its modern borders. And then by 1814, early in 1814, we start seeing the British arriving on the Apalachicola River, arriving in Pensacola, setting the stage for the campaign here on the Gulf Coast. So the British planned. They had two groups of people that they were really wanting to recruit and try to build up their army. First, we've got to talk a little bit about the Creek War that had been going on in 1813 and in 1814. This is a whole hour-long presentation in itself. I'm going to make it about 2 minutes for you. Long story short is back around 1700 or so, the Creeks in Alabama and Georgia and Northwest Florida had begun trading with the British over on the East Coast. And after about 100 years of trading and cultural assimilation and intermarriage, a lot of Creeks were living very much like Americans. A lot of them had taken up farming, plantation, agriculture, and living very much an American lifestyle. But there were a number of Creeks who said, this isn't a good idea. We're losing our culture. We're losing what makes us unique. We need to stop this. So by the early 19th century, there had been a growing rift among the Creek Nation that eventually explodes into a civil war early in 1813. And for several months, it's just an internal conflict. But in July, some of those Red Sticks come to Pensacola for supplies, and on their way back into the Creek territory, they're attacked by some American militia at a place called Burnt Corn Creek, which is just north of Brewton, Alabama today. The Red Sticks retaliate by attacking a place called Fort Mims, which was located in present-day North Baldwin County. A lot of Creeks, a lot of American settlers are killed there, and that's what brings the United States into the conflict. So, long story short, there's a lot of battles. One Tennessee militia general named Andrew Jackson leads a big campaign down from Tennessee, has a big decisive battle with the the Red Stick Creeks, which were the more traditionalist faction, at a place called Horseshoe Bend, and that was the last major battle of the Creek War in May of 1814. But the surviving Red Sticks, a lot of them come down to Pensacola and to the Florida Panhandle, where they are seeking food from the Spanish governor, and the Spanish governor is saying, I barely have enough food to feed my own soldiers, much less thousands of Creek refugees. But this war had really decimated the Creek territory. Nearly every Creek town had been destroyed. All the livestock had been destroyed. All the crops had been destroyed. So the Creeks were in a very dire situation in 1814. And just to clarify a little bit more, it had been a civil war. So you had one group of Creeks that were more friendly with the United States than with the Americans, and who actually are fighting with the United States soldiers. And then the other side is the Red Sticks, who were the more traditionalists, saying we need to go back to our traditional way of life and resist all this American expansion into our territory. So that's what had been going on prior to the British arrival on the Gulf Coast. The other group of people that the British are trying to recruit are the enslaved here on the Gulf Coast. There was a British proclamation that gets issued saying if you're enslaved, come to a British ship, come to a British fort, you'll be granted your freedom, and if you so choose, you can enlist in the military. And so this proclamation gets spread all around. It was written really towards those enslaved by the United States, but the British were applying it here in Spanish West Florida as well. So what we see is over 300 people here in Pensacola go to the British soldiers, get their freedom. Over 100 men enlist and join the Colonial Marine Unit. And so these guys are getting dressed in the British uniforms, as well as the Red Sticks. They're getting dressed in British uniforms as well, and they are drilling and practicing and marching all around in this part of downtown Pensacola. So in May of 1814, the British have arrived on the Apalachicola River, start unloading some supplies, food, weapons, ammunition. They're trying to feed as many of these Red Stick Creeks as they can. One of the Red Stick leaders was a guy named Josiah Francis. He had been living up in present-day Alabama and had become was one of the main Red Stick leaders. He was very much on this idea of we need to return to our traditional way of life and keep all these Americans out of our territory. But he wrote that our case is really miserable and lamentable. We've been driven from house and home without food and clothing to cover our bodies by disasters and by an enemy who has sworn our ruin. We are hovering about Pensacola and its vicinity where we can get no assistance, as the Spanish government tells us it can scarcely support its own troops. So the British are recruiting these guys. They send officers out to train and recruit Red Sticks. They're providing as much support as they can. By July, the British have arrived in Pensacola. So they send several ships here into Pensacola, start unloading some troops. The British officers, Edward Nichols is kind of our main guy here. He meets with the Spanish governor, and he realizes that the Spanish have been losing a lot of territory to the Americans. They would probably be okay with joining up. So the British come in. They're allowed to take over all the forts here in town. There was where we are today had been surrounded by a very large fort, but most of it had rotted away by the early 19th century. The main fort for Pensacola was up the hill on Palafox. It had been this fort here called Fort George by the British. At this point, it's Fort San Miguel is what the Spanish have called it. It's pretty rotten, it's pretty run down, but the British are repairing it. They're also in control of the fort out at Fort Barrancas, where that stands today. It was a wooden fort at that point, where the brick fort sits today. They put the British and the Spanish flag flying side by side over the fort. Nichols says that we're strengthening the fort, and it is the worst I have ever saw. So it said it was very rotten, and that as soon as we build up one part, another part tumbles down. So it's not in the best state. But all this activity is going on here in Pensacola and in Florida. This is not going on without notice of the Americans. Andrew Jackson is very aware of what's going on. Jackson had been a militia general for Tennessee, but after his big victory at Horseshoe Bend, the United States government took note and they made him a general in the U.S. Army. So by this point, he is a general in the U.S. Army. And this is not the slide that this was my notes, not the slide I had updated. But Jackson and Governor Manrique here, they start exchanging some letters. And I've been reading these letters and they are hilarious. So I just want to share a little bit from them. So in July, Jackson writes saying that he's informed that the enemies of the United States have sought refuge and asylum in the territory of Spain. They're being fed by order of the governor. And he basically goes on to say, Josiah Francis, Peter McQueen, another Red Stick leader, tells the Spanish to turn them over to the United States. Manrique replies a few days later with a very amusing letter in a very high, flowy, flowery language that basically says, the Red Sticks, they're not here. And even if they were, I wouldn't turn them over because they're here seeking shelter in Spanish Florida. Jackson was not amused by that. So he says, I will remark that I regret extremely the evasive, hostile spirit which pervades your whole letter, so inconsistent with the high, frank Spanish character that you have assumed. So he calls him out. He basically says that you're harboring these guys, we're going to come get them. He ends his letter saying an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and a scalp for a scalp. Then Manrique replies back basically saying, yes, I have armed the Indians, but we're doing it to protect ourselves from your aggressions. You've been taking our territory. And Jackson says, aha, basically, at last, you have admitted that you are arming the Red Sticks. So they're exchanging letters back and forth. Some American spies even come down into Pensacola. One was Captain John Jones. He dresses as a merchant, supposedly coming to buy coffee. And his horse gets loose and runs up to the fort at San Miguel. And the commandant at the fort catches the horse and is like, hey, you got your horse, you want to tour the fort? And Jones says, yes, absolutely, I'd love a tour of your fort. So he goes back, writes a detailed account of the fortifications, the state of the city, draws a map, sends that all back. Another guy, Captain John Jones, he was the captain of the spies and scouts. He comes down to Pensacola as well. And he wasn't hiding that he was here in town. He actually came with a letter to give to the Spanish governor. And while he was here, just made friends with everybody in town and got lots of information that he sends back as well. So the Americans know that the Red Stick leaders are in town. They know that British soldiers are in town. They know that the British and Spanish flags are flying above the forts. So by July, some of, not Jackson himself, but some of his officers start prepping for an attack into Spanish Florida. Thomas Hart Benton, he has an interesting history with Jackson. He and his brother had actually gotten into a bar brawl, and his brother shot Jackson, and Jackson stabbed one of these guys. They'd gotten into a big fight in Tennessee about a year earlier. Now they're friends. Benton is serving under Jackson. He will later go on to help promote Jackson to the office of the president later on. But Benton organizes a joint militia and U.S. Army expedition, as well as some friendly Choctaws who have allied themselves with the United States. They meet at the head of the Perdido River, and Benton actually winds up getting sick, and so he has to turn command over to a guy named Nixon. But they make their way into Escambia County, build a breastwork probably up near Brat, Florida, make their way down to the Escambia River where they have some skirmish with some of the Red Stick Creeks. They actually cross the river, destroy a creek town near Chumuckla, and then will proceed to fight along the Escambia River all the way down to Florida town where they have another battle. But they eventually wind up going back up into U.S. territory. The Choctaws are continuing to have skirmishes throughout Escambia County with the Red Sticks. This guy here, this is Pushmataha. He was the principal chief of the Choctaws. He was very much on board with allying with the United States. He was actually made a general in the U.S. Army and is actually buried in Washington, D.C. But there's a number of skirmishes going on all throughout Escambia County, a place called Alligator Holes, which was probably somewhere around Molino, some more skirmishes near Shamakla. And this is just a map where some of those skirmishes are taking place all around the area. But while this is going on, the British start planning an attack on Fort Boyer on Mobile Bay. This was their first step to making their way to New Orleans. So Fort Boyer, after the United States took Mobile, they go down to the entrance to Mobile Bay. They build a small earthen fortification. It's where Fort Morgan sits today. If you've been out to that brick fort, this was the fort predating that one. It was a pretty small fort, but the Americans, thanks to some intelligence here in Pensacola, got word that the attack was coming. They start making their preparations. And they have quite a big battle on September 14th through 16th. The British send over a number of Royal Marines and Colonial Marines and Red Sticks and 4 ships. And they wind up having quite a big battle here. One of the British ships actually is sunk by the Americans, and it had gotten too close and hit a sandbar, and the British had to get off of it. Colonel Nichols was actually wounded and was blinded in one eye here at this battle. But the Americans put up quite a defense. They were able to repel that British attack. Jackson was very, very pleased. The officer in command was a guy named Lawrence. Jackson said, "The gallant Lawrence with his little Spartan band has given them a lecture that will last for ages." So the British were repelled. They weren't able to capture Mobile Bay. They come back to Pensacola and start regrouping. And by this point, Jackson's come down very close. He's assembled an army, and they are making plans for capturing Pensacola. So Jackson's put together a 4,000 man army. It's made up of U.S. regulars from the 3rd, 39th, and 44th Infantries. They've got Tennessee militia. They've got Choctaw warriors. They've got Mississippi dragoons, soldiers on horseback. So they are ready to go. So they make their way down from Fort Montgomery, which had been built just near Fort Mims over in Baldwin County. They marched their way down, essentially came down Highway 97 from Atmore, if you've been that way, came out and made their way down, essentially Highway 29, and then make their way down here to Pensacola. They get pretty close to Pensacola, just north of Fort San Miguel, and Jackson sends one of his officers under a flag of truce carrying a letter to the fort to demand its surrender, essentially. But before he can get to the fort starts firing cannons at him. So they retreat and move around, and this fort just keeps firing cannons at this guy with the flag of truce. So he makes his way back to the army. And Jackson, they had captured a Spanish soldier. He was either a sergeant or a corporal, both were listed. But they send this captured Spanish guy into the fort with the letter. And I'll read just a little bit more from those letters. Jackson essentially says that I come not as an enemy of Spain, but I come with a force sufficient to prevent the repetition of those acts so injurious to the U.S. and so inconsistent with the neutral character of Spain. He goes on to say, peacefully surrender the forts and all will be well. But if they are not peaceably surrendered, let the blood of your subjects be on your head. I will not hold myself responsible for the conduct of my enraged soldiers. And then I have the honor to be most respectfully your humble and obedient servant, Major Jackson. They always sign the letters. Very, very fun. So then after this guy had been fired upon, Jackson writes another letter basically saying, I am at a loss to know why this conduct has been carried out with the intention to insult my flag. And so eventually the Spanish governor gets these letters. He writes some letters back to Jackson saying, well, this flag for parley surprises me since they are used only between nations who are at war, in which situation we are not. And then he goes on to say, you may therefore spare yourself the trouble of similar messages. I am resolved to repel by force the attempt you may make, holding you responsible for the blood which may be shed by your attempting to carry into effect your ill-grounded demand. May God preserve you for many years. They go on to write some more letters back and forth. Ultimately, Jackson just says, we're capturing the town, and that's that. So, this is what Pensacola is looking like in 1814. So down here we've got the Central Plaza. This is where the Spanish and the British had built a very large fort back in the 1700s. By the early 19th century, the fort walls have rotted away. Some of the buildings have burned down. But we still had 4 large blockhouses in the streets of Pensacola that remained from this old fort. And a blockhouse is essentially a large 2-story structure, very well defended. It's where you can place your cannons. It's where you can place your soldiers to fire at the attacking enemy. We had 2 creeks and water really all around Pensacola. This was Cadet Creek. Over to the west, we had Washerwoman's Creek or San Gabriel Creek. There are a number of blockhouses and small pickets all around the perimeter. And then way up at the north, at the top of the hill, we have Fort San Miguel, formerly Fort George. That is really the main defense for Pensacola. So Jackson had come in from the north, and after they send these letters back and forth, he winds up moving over to the west side of town to the head of Bayou Chico and establishes an encampment there. This was the same encampment, the same location that Galvez had been at back during the American Revolution. So they determined that they're going to leave a few hundred soldiers in this camp, keep the fires burning, send some men walking around to make it look like that's where they're going to be and where the attack's going to come from. And in the middle of the night, Jackson takes the other 3,600 soldiers he's got up and around, and they come out on the east side of the town, probably about where the Circle K is now, over there near the Gulf Power Building, Florida Power and Light Building. And they start marching their way down in toward the town, catching everybody by surprise. Jackson divides the soldiers up into several columns, and I've read several first-hand accounts of the battle. I've got about 6 different accounts, and some of them say they had 3 columns of soldiers, but a couple of them say there were 4 columns of soldiers. And one of the ones saying that there were 4 was Jackson himself. So it was 3 or 4, we're not exactly sure. But what we had was this main column here came marching down Government Street. This was the U.S. infantry. They had a couple of cannons that they were dragging along with them, but they got stuck in the sand in the street, so they had to leave the cannons behind. So you had your main U.S. infantry column here. You had your Tennessee militia column coming down Intendencia Street. And on the north side of the town, roughly about where Romana Street is today, was the Choctaw Warriors. And then there may or may not have been a 4th column of militia coming down Zaragoza Street as well. These 4 blockhouses, they had Spanish soldiers in them, and outside of this one, probably around the north side of Seville Square, was a battery of 2 cannons placed in the street. And these 2 cannons are firing at the infantry soldiers as they're marching down the street. They're able to get about 3 shots off with this cannon. They're firing a grape shot, which is just basically like a shotgun firing at the soldiers. Several of the officers and soldiers are struck. But the infantry winds up doing a bayonet charge and capturing those 2 cannons, that battery in the street. And very quickly, all the soldiers rush into the town. There's some fighting going on, probably around where Seville Square is today. But very quickly, the Americans overwhelm the Spanish forces and capture the city. All of the British that had been here in the town, they have loaded up on the ships. They got on their ships the night before. They're evacuating, leaving the Spanish to defend the city the best they can. Pretty quickly, Jackson comes in. He finds the Spanish governor. They come over here to the intendant's office, which was located around Palafox and Intendencia Street. The intendant was a Spanish official here in the town. And they meet to agree to the terms of surrender. And while Jackson's waiting on the Spanish governor to show up, the British ships start firing cannon shots over the town. And Jackson is suspecting treachery, so he says, go find the Spanish governor, bring him to my location. Sure enough, the cannon stopped shortly thereafter. But it takes about a day or 2 to get everything settled down. Governor Manrique agreed to surrender the town to the Americans. However, there were still soldiers up there at Fort San Miguel, and the guy in charge at Fort San Miguel was not ready to give up just yet. So as the American troops start making their way up toward it, he starts firing at them, injuring a couple of soldiers. And Jackson sends some troops to the higher ground up above, has them start building a battery with cannons pointing down at this fort. Finally, he realizes, okay, I'll give up. So pretty quickly, the Americans take control of the town. Later that evening, they hear explosions coming from the direction of Fort Barrancas. And they realize that the British have sailed out of Pensacola Bay, blowing up Fort Barrancas and blowing up all the gunpowder and all the supplies on their way out. All the Red Sticks had retreated across Escambia Bay by this point. So now that the fort has been, this fort's been captured, Fort Barrancas has been destroyed, Jackson looks around and says, okay, our work here is done, the British are gone, the Red Sticks are gone, we'll turn the city back over to the Spanish. And so that was the battle here at Pensacola. The British evacuate, they fall back to the Apalachicola River where they had initially kind of created their first base of operations. And they build 2 fortifications on the Apalachicola River. Down on the lower end, they build the fort that you see here at a place called Prospect Bluff. And they build another fort up where Chattahoochee is located today. That one was called Nichols Fort. So they build 2 fortifications on the Apalachicola River. Thousands of Creek refugees are still in the area coming to these forts seeking assistance. All of the people that had gained their freedom by joining the British military, they are here at these forts as well. And after Jackson leaves Pensacola, they're eventually going to make their way over to New Orleans. But he leaves behind 1,000 soldiers under command of Uriah Blue to march throughout the Florida Panhandle and find any Red Stick Creeks that are still in the area. Blue, he's got a whole bunch of people, Tennessee Militia, Choctaw Creek, and Chickasaw Warriors, and a guy named David Crockett. He had shown up with the Tennessee Militia. He showed up in town here just after the battle had taken place, but he's still here with Uriah Blue, and they start marching around in December. They make their way through the Florida Panhandle. They have a few skirmishes here and there, but this was they were very poorly supplied. They were very hungry. It was a very cold, wet winter that year. So they were pretty miserable, and they marched their way all the way down to the Choctahoochee River. They eventually turn around and make their way all the way back to Pensacola and get back here on January 9th. So while Uriah Blue and David Crockett are marching around the swamps of northwest Florida, Andrew Jackson has chased the British all the way down to New Orleans. I won't go into too much detail about this battle. I think we're all pretty familiar with it. Jackson had dug in behind a canal with thousands of troops. The British come in, trying to make their way toward the city, and it was really a bloodbath for the British. They were repelled crossing the Phillips there at Chalmette. So it was a major resounding victory for the United States, a big defeat for the British. However, unbeknownst to everybody, a treaty had been signed in December on Christmas Eve, I believe it was, between the United States and Great Britain agreeing to end the war. However, the treaty had not yet been ratified. It had to be ratified by the British government and by the American government. And so, even though a treaty technically had been signed, it was not ratified and both nations were still at war. So the British were not done yet. They were determined to try to capture something on the Gulf Coast. So they go back to Fort Boyer. And this time, they, well, for one, had learned how not to launch an attack on Fort Boyer their first time around. So this time they came with 5,000 troops, where they had just a couple of hundred before. Their ships stay away from the fort's artillery. They put the fort under siege and are able to capture it after 3 days. Jackson, who had been so singing the praises of Lawrence and his little Spartan band, was very disappointed that they surrendered the fort, even though they were vastly outnumbered and really had no other opportunity. So the British capture Fort Boyer, and 2 days later, word arrives the war is over. So they have to give the fort back and go home. So the British turn Fort Boyer back over to the Americans. This had taken place in early February. They make their way back to Prospect Bluff, start getting all their affairs in order, and they start evacuating in late April and early May. So the British leave West Florida behind. They take most everyone with them. All of those colonial Marines and their families that had gained their freedom, they were given an opportunity to go settle anywhere they wanted to in the British Empire. So quite a few of them went to the Bahamas, some of them went up to Canada where they settled as free settlers, but a couple of hundred did stay behind at this fort at Prospect Bluff. And for the next couple of years, they're going to be there farming and living freely in Florida, but that will eventually come back up in 1816 when the Americans will go in and destroy that fort. Josiah Francis, who had been here, he goes back to England with the British to plead his case with the British to try to get some support for the Red Sticks, who were still trying to resist American encroachment into their territory. And all of this that took place, the Creek War, the War of 1812, even though treaties have been signed, even though the wars technically have ended, it really didn't end. Francis and Peter McQueen, those guys, they're going to come back, and when the Americans do start trying to move into this territory that they've gained under treaty in Georgia and in Alabama, it's going to spark another war. And then we'll get the first Seminole War taking place in 1817 and 1818. A lot of these people are going to be involved in the next war. And of course, then there was the second Seminole War, then there was the third Seminole War, all the way into the 1850s. Pretty much up to the eve of the Civil War, all of this continues. So that is an overview of the War of 1812 on the Gulf Coast. Before I wrap it up, I'll just talk a little bit about the uniforms and some of the equipment that these guys would have been wearing. So when the War of 1812 started out, the American Army's uniforms were quite elaborate. You had red collars and cuffs, you had all this braiding and trim on the uniforms. They were wearing felt hats initially, but pretty quickly the Army grows very rapidly, and the government realizes that's a lot of stuff on those uniforms. So they trim it back in 1813. They take off all the braiding. They keep the red collars and cuffs. They pretty quickly realize felt hats don't hold up very well when they get rained on, so they switch those out for leather shakos. And then within just a few months, they say, you know what, let's go ahead and get rid of all that red trim. Let's just go with a nice, simple blue coat. White pants, white cotton pants in the summertime, blue wool pants in the wintertime. The Southern troops were also issued white cotton coatees as well. I've got some examples of those up here you can check out afterwards. But guess who was providing most of the blue wool cloth to the United States? England. So pretty quickly they are having supply shortages. So they start substituting for gray wool. So you had some troops in these gray wool coats. The blue wool trousers for the winter often became gray wool trousers in the winter. So you had some troops all in gray. You had some guys in brown and all sorts of different colors. They were just using whatever they had essentially. And in fact, had the war continued, there was even discussions on just making the national uniform of the United States all gray, which is kind of ironic because in a few decades, that's what the Confederates would be wearing during the Civil War. You also had your militia troops, and militias were different than the regular U.S. Army. The U.S. Army was under federal control. It was a job. You signed up to be in the Army for several years. That was your job. Militias were just made up of ordinary citizens from each state or territory. At that point, typically you were if you were a citizen of that territory, if you were a male between a certain age, it was your job to just be in the militia. So they would meet every so often. But the militias were under the control of the state governor. So if, for example, the governor of Georgia says, my troops are only going to fight in Georgia, those militia troops are only going to fight in Georgia. However, you had some states, like Tennessee, for example, said, yeah, send the troops to Canada. We're in this all the way. But a lot of those New England militias, they were like, we don't really support this. They're not leaving the state. So militia guys, they wore whatever the state prescribed. Sometimes, especially for the Western territories, it was very much just your hunting clothes. Whatever you had, that's what you wore. Some militias were a little more elaborate, especially the more eastern states. Their uniforms oftentimes looked very similar to the U.S. Army. But the Tennessee militia, a lot of these guys are wearing these blue and these red trimmed frock coats to give them a kind of a uniform. appearance. So that is the official end of my presentation. If y'all have any questions, I'm glad to answer any of those that I can. And like I said, I've got all sorts of stuff up here. We'll turn the lights back on and you can check out all the gear that these soldiers would have been carrying. Everything up here that I've got, the uniform, the equipment, everything's reproduction of what they would have had at the time period. There's people that really do meticulous research into this, looking at surviving examples, looking at the documentation that the government provided on how these uniforms should be made. So this uniform that I'm wearing has been all hand-stitched, all tailored as it would have been at the time period. I've got some examples of the food that the soldiers would have been eating at the time. It wasn't very good. The Army basically said you get a pound of meat and a pound of bread a day. But of course, fresh meat and fresh bread are not going to last very long. So instead of fresh bread, you got these lovely rock-hard biscuits. They gave you some salted meat, and that's all you got. But they wanted the soldiers to be happy, so they did give them a rum ration every day. But definitely come up, check that out. Does anybody have any questions about anything? Anything at all? Yes.
You kept referring to multiple groups of Indians, the Choctaws, the Creeks. Is that how and why the current day Indian groups all have different declared lineages and they say they're all different?
Yeah, so basically, going back to the probably 1700s, that's when you start seeing the development of the tribes in the southeast that we have today. After the European contact and the end of the Mississippian era, all the various groups kind of came together and formed what we know today. So each group was in different regions. So the Choctaw were in what's basically southern Mississippi. The Chickasaw were kind of in the northern Mississippi area. The Creeks, they're the group I'm most familiar with, and the Creeks weren't really a unified tribe. It was more of a confederation. There was about 40 to 50 Creek towns in present-day Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and every town was its own group, its own tribal group. But they kind of came together under this big umbrella, this kind of loose confederation. And so you kind of had this loose confederation of the upper Creek towns in Alabama and the lower Creek towns in Florida and Georgia. And when the U.S. government comes along, they just want to deal with one group of people. And that was kind of an issue because the Creeks were not just one unified group of people. So that was a big part of playing into this kind of splintering and what turned into the Creek Civil War. The U.S. government creates this national council of kind of hand-picked Creek leaders that were friendly to the United States, and that was the people that they dealt with and signing treaties and things like that. But then you had other people that had been left out of that council that kind of eventually become the Red States. So it gets very complicated very quickly. There's a lot of cultural and political issues going on.
Even today.
Yeah. So that's kind of the simple version that I gave you. As best I could, as best as I understand. Yes.
You mentioned the skirmishes and the soldiers over Shalapa. Did I hear you say Brad?
Yes, so when Nixon and Benton, that big group, comes down, they crossed into Escambia County, up there around Brat, and we think that's probably where they built a breastwork to store some of their supplies. Essentially, they go in, they dig a trench, they pile the dirt up about yay high in a big square and left some of their luggage and goods behind to come back for later. And up there in Brat, there is a breastworks creek and a breastworks road that crosses that creek. So it's very likely that was probably the area where they built that. And there was surveyors going along with the Army that would write down, we marched this many miles and we went this many miles this day. And if you do the mileage, it kind of comes up to that general region. I've looked so hard trying to find it. I've looked at LiDAR and maps and historical maps. I haven't been able to pin anything down, but probably in that region.
Is there any artifacts that were been found up at Shalapa?
I don't know. Not that I'm aware of, but quite possibly. But that is the Santa Rosa Creek tribe over there in Milton. They have their big Creek Festival every every year. In the last few years, we've been working with them to do a reenactment of that battle. So if you come out to Creek Fest the weekend before Thanksgiving, we'll be doing a reenactment talking about that time period.
Okay.
Yes.
So I know sounds like there's a lot of documentation from Jackson's letters and stuff. Is there documentation of the regular army and the militia that fought for the U.S. in Battle of Pensacola in the area? Does that exist? The roles?
Yeah, so I've been on the hunt for several years trying to find all this documentation. So I've come across about 6 different accounts of the battle here at Pensacola. Andrew Jackson wrote several letters. There's a book called Correspondence of Andrew Jackson by John Bassett. It was put together a long time ago, but it's all of his letters back and forth. So there are sources there. I found John Coffey wrote a letter about the battle. That was one of Jackson's generals. David Crockett wrote, he wasn't here for the battle, he showed up the day after, but he wrote down he has an autobiography. And in that autobiography, he talks about this campaign in Florida and being here around Pensacola. David Crockett. Yep. And then I found just a few other sources. If you get with me after, I can give you my email and I can link you to some of those. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. I've been on the hunt for years trying to find as much documentation of this that I can.
I was up in Lincoln County doing some geological research, and it turns out that's where the muster was, so I went to the field where he did his muster with the volunteers before they came down to fight the Creeks and then went to Pensacola. And about every 4th kiosk, it talks about Pensacola and where they went, so I think that might be another location.
Yeah, is that Camp Blunt in
Yes.
Tennessee?
Yeah.
Yes. They do a living history event next weekend.
They just redid their archives, you might find it.
I'll have to look into that.
They
Yeah.
really nice camera archives.
Anything else? Yes.
It's interesting, my grandparents, one side of one branch of my family came to Baldwin County in about 1820 to 1830. But the Indians we talked about was the southern creeks in that area. But what all did they, first of all, I've always heard, but then my grandson says it's not true, that one of the different tribes of Indians had their own alphabet. Is that true?
Yes. So it was the Cherokee. The Cherokee around the 1820s, 30s developed a written language. And yeah, they were publishing newspapers in a written language. Prior to that, most everything was oral for the Native Americans. So that was, I believe, one of the first developments of a written language, at least in this era. So, but there are surviving letters, from a lot of these Creek guys where they were writing in Spanish and in English and, the different languages of the time.
Well, did they include all those branches of the tribes in the Trail of Tears? Which is another
Yeah, so that comes around a little bit later. There's these various treaties of land cessions. At the end of the Creek War in 1814, the Creeks lost a massive chunk of land to the United States in 1814. But within the next, several decades, by the 1820s, 30s, the Americans are pushing west. And that's around the time that the Indian Removal Act comes around and gets passed through Congress. Jackson was president at that time and signs it into law. So Trail of Tears comes around in 1836, and that's when you see a lot of people being forced to move out west to present-day Oklahoma. And there were some that resisted and kind of went underground. There had been a lot of assimilation with the Europeans and the Americans at this point. So a lot of people that did stay behind, they just didn't advertise their Native American heritage. And you see that even into the 20th century, where a lot of people just kind of kept it on the down low. So you're seeing descendants of those people still in the area today that are really revitalizing their culture.
Well, I was curious because one of my great grandfathers was fought in the War of 1812, and he still had. I don't think they made travel down there. I think it was later. So he must have fought up on the coast of North Carolina.
Could have been, yeah. Any other questions? Anything else? All right, well, thank you all for coming out.